Hekmat, I wanted you to respond to the dominant Western media narrative that we're getting, which is that, this is basically the HTS government responding to ambushes by what is called Assad loyalists. All the people who are being targeted are quote unquote Assad loyalists. And, one of the outlets that adopted this narrative is Democracy Now! And I'm showing this just because this highlights that even at the dissenting end of the spectrum in the US, we get this uniform narrative, even from people who should be challenging establishment propaganda, not parroting it.
News from Syria, at least 70 people were killed, dozens more wounded. In overnight clashes between Syrian forces and fighters loyal to the deposed leader Bashar al-Assad, dozens of Syrian authorities were targeted in various ambush attacks by Assad loyalists in the Latakia and Tartus provinces, which have long been strongholds for Assad's toppled government.
So there we go. This is the government now is responding to ambushes by Assad loyalists in the strongholds of the Assad government. So basically, this is all just being done by people who want to bring back Bashar al-Assad, and that's what all this is about.
Yeah, well, Amy Goodman also partially to blame for this Western narrative that connected the crimes of the Assad family to the Alawites en masse. But that's beside the point. They've done essentially a Hezbollah trick of cutting off the scale of escalation right when it's convenient. As I said at the start of the stream, there are a clear set of escalations that have led to this point. The Alawites, some of them, the majority of them, believed the promises of the HTS government when they took power in the 8th of December, and large proportions of them laid down their guns and their armaments, trusting in that promise that they're going to be able to have a dignified life and they're not going to be subjected to sectarian-based provocations and aggression. But that's just not turned out to be true. As I showed before, and as I shared in some X posts here, this is a clear outcome from a gradually increasing set of escalations against the Alawite communities in the west of Syria. So you had already 14 people killed in February 27th. You had February 27th, we saw 4 people in CCTV footage that every single person in Syria saw. Just 4 men being executed summarily in their own store, their grocery store. And you've seen a lot of kidnappings, a lot of aggression against the Alawite community, where some leaders of the Alawite community decided that we need to protect ourselves. We need to potentially try and get some deal in this ongoing balkanization of the Syrian state, where we could potentially get leverage, get cards on the table to get some sort of an autonomous region that is Alawite. You got to remember this, you have 3 to 4 million Alawites. They are now living in a country and under a government that considers them, in the worst case scenario, considers them pigs and apostates, and in the best case scenario considers them second-class citizens who are all responsible for the crimes of the last 14 years against the other parts of the Syrian people, the Syrian community. So under international law, they're allowed to seek out some sort of independence or sovereignty. They're allowed to protect themselves against incursions from other entities in the same country. And one last point that everyone neglects to mention: yes, we've been through a horrible 14-year civil war that's been proxy war, a bloody war, but in transitional justice, as it's defined by the United Nations and the precedent that was established by the United Nations, you either have amnesty for all or you have justice for all. You can't pick and choose. You can't choose that you're going to come with daggers for revenge against the Alawite community and decide to lay ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of their supporters off the hook. That's just not how it's going to work for the future of the Syrian people. Themselves will never accept that. So you're not going to, it's impossible to make that argument. That argument falls flat when you recognize the facts on the ground.
Yeah, the hatred of Alawites has been inculcated into Syria through this into the Sunni population through the poisonous broadcasts emerging from the Gulf since the so-called Arab Spring. And you have like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the favorite of Al Jazeera Arabic, who is saying Alawites are infidels, like the worst infidels, like the worst possible infidels. I can just go on YouTube and find, if I look up like the origins of the Alawi sect, I'm going to find so many Sunni preachers just denouncing them, delivering hour-long lectures on what repugnant animals they are, and all the hideous practices that they proliferate across Syria. And then they claim they're not pushing sectarianism. I mean, and that's just in English for like a YouTube audience. It's not even like regulated there. But it's been ever since the Gulf states started really pushing their influence in Syria, a social poison, and now it's playing out before our eyes. Will this spread to attacks on the Christian population of Syria and actually start getting the US to care? Because no one seems to care about the Alawites in the West or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Here's one post, by the way. Here's this one post just from Twitter. They're now looting Alawite and Christian stores and houses after having killed off entire villages and cities. And again, we can't confirm exactly what is real and what's not, because a lot of things can be said. But I mean, it's just, I'm getting all kinds of claims like this from people that I know inside Syria. It just sounds really, really ugly. And of course, our media will do a terrible job of covering this because they've been whitewashing this for more than a decade. It's true that when Christians are attacked, that gets more attention in the West because that's just so much harder to suppress, given that, a lot of the US is a Christian culture. But even that has been totally whitewashed too. And it's so cynical. The US spends billions of dollars in a secret, dirty war that is barely covered. The New York Times had a couple of stories on it. Western media barely acknowledges it. Then you have the crippling sanctions, which are like the invisible killer, which no one ever acknowledges. They're still ongoing now. Some of the people who, as Max talked about, were responsible for those sanctions now want to have them removed, but it's not happening. And so they're continuing to tear this country apart. And in that situation, and when you have a government that's ruled by the former leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria and former deputy leader of ISIS, of course you're going to have sectarianism. Of course,
this is a helicopter attack on an Alawite neighborhood.
And what do we get? When we would criticize the sectarian nature of the insurgency, like what were we called? We were called
Islamophobes.
Yeah, which is like saying you're an anti-Semite if you're critical of the Jewish supremacist state. To criticize Al-Qaeda is not to be Islamophobic. It's just to criticize sectarian fanaticism that slaughters people because they're of a different sect, which is what not all the Syrian insurgency, but the dominant strain of it has been. And now they're in power, and now they're empowered to go and carry out sectarian slaughters like we're seeing right now.
That was like the weaponization of Islamophobia, the same way that Zionists weaponize anti-Semitism. It was being weaponized by Muslim Zionists who want to exist in a multicultural reality in the West where they are respected and have equal civil and religious rights, while forming a religious supremacist state in a country far away that might have been their country of origin or not. I remember a lot of Pakistani American journalists and activists calling me an Islamophobe for criticizing the Syrian opposition. They weren't even Syrian, but it's Muslim Zionism, and the weaponization of that term is just being exposed. It's as completely hollow right now because this is what we were warning about. And most of them, certainly not the Sorosy professional activist types from foundation-backed fake activist NGOs, certainly not the Trotskyist academic types and grad students. Those types who denounced us over the past few years have nothing to say about this right now. It's like not even on their radar.
Yeah, they just move on to the next hustle, the next regime change, proxy war hustle, which right now is Ukraine, and they forget about the countries that they took part in cheering for the destruction of. I mean, that's what happened to Syria
Well,
in cheering on the proxy war. You were cheering on the country's destruction.
Well, those are the people that divided the Palestine solidarity movement, because they were like the liberal class, the NGO class that infested that movement. And they all, you know, a lot of them might support BDS and they'll march for Palestine, but ultimately they're empire flunkies and they support the same system, the same imperial system that has doomed Palestine. So they've maybe momentarily moved on to Palestine for now. Some of them did have, you know, Ukraine flags and Palestine flags in their bios. No names, but they support Palestine simply from a liberal perspective, that it's just a human rights issue. It's not an issue of imperialism. And now they're silent. They're totally silent. There's nothing they can say. The only people you hear from are like the really sectarian Ikhwan types. But Hekmat, you know, feel free to weigh in here.
Yeah. The rhetoric online has become a dead space in the middle with a robust, extreme, like fascist Sunni right that I can describe, just out in the open in Arabic, calling for the extermination of minorities, primarily Alawites. And then some in the extreme far left of this spectrum, you know, making some amends, trying to call out the violence, trying to call for, yeah, I recognize that we live under HES, Al-Qaeda rule, but we need to figure out a way for us to build this country together, like living high, head in the sky, not really recognizing the situation. But the overwhelming majority is happening on that robust, almost fascistic approach to Syria, where it's just vilifying their fellow compatriots and seeing them as lesser than, seeing them as pigs, and calling for the purification of their lands, of their towns, their cities, their neighborhoods. Yeah, I wanted to add something. I sent you the aftermath, if you want, in the last link of one of those bombs or barrel bombs or these indiscriminate yeah. Where's yeah, where's Charles Lister? Where are the folks?
Where's
from
Ken
the
Roth,
Where's
former
Ken?
permanent leader of Human Rights Watch?
This looks indiscriminate to me.
Is Clarissa Ward going to rush to the scene and find dismembered bodies or survivors? Where's Clarissa Ward?
Yeah. So yeah, that's the situation on the ground right now. There's another clip that I sent you. It's this, again, this almost fascistic interpretation of Islam that is now roaming around the streets of Syria. If you want to play the clip, and I can translate, there's translation in the bio of the clip. But growing up in Syria, whenever I would go to, like, I'll have my basketball practice in Aleppo, or I'll have, I'll go on a hike, or I'll go on a walk with some friends. During the months of Ramadan, I could eat in the streets if I wanted to. I can drink water. Sometimes I'll get some looks, but I wasn't gonna get met with the reaction that you see in this Twitter post that I shared with you, the one labeled Ramadan.
Is this it?
Yeah, now it's become the norm for some of these HES jihadis. In some other videos, it's Uyghurs, it's Turkmenistanis, it's Tajiks and Uzbeks walking around the streets of the cities that they are coming in as guests or supposed liberators, and enforcing forced fasting, forced public fasting, telling people that in the month of Ramadan, they're not allowed to smoke, they're not allowed to eat, they're not allowed to drink water. This is just not how the Syrian society existed for the last 70 years of its existence up until this moment. We had a mosaic of different cultures and sects, and people in this pluralistic society lived and coexisted, sometimes. But this is now the norm. Patrols with AK-47s next to your passenger seat, ready to intimidate anyone who's just smoking or eating or drinking in the streets.
All right, so go ahead. Let me turn down the volume and you can translate this.
Yeah, he's telling him, put down the smoke. He's asking him to be ashamed of ashamed of himself for smoking and or potentially eating in the streets in the middle of the Ramadan. Yeah, keep watching this video. Actually, he comes back for his AK-47 to intimidate this person. Because the guy who's smoking asks him. The guy who's smoking, the second guy who's smoking, asks him like, "Are you part of the security forces to tell me to put down my smoke?" And then the guy says, "Yes, I am," and goes back in to reach for his AK-47. So this is the situation on the ground. Added to it, desecration of Christian cemeteries, desecration of Alawite tombs and places of worship, Kurds being mistreated, Druze being mistreated. So it's just outrageously imbecilic of the HTS government. If you wanna keep this country, if you want to keep the country that you became the leadership of, from balkanizing, this is just not the way you should run things. This is the opposite of how you should run things if you don't want Israel to show up and allow for a Druze protectorate state to develop in the south, and for the David corridor to protect the Kurds in the south, in the northeast, and for a potential even Alawite state to form under a protectorate of Israelis or Russian protection in the West. So yeah, it's just asinine.
Yeah, I mean, you see tons of reports every day about, teachers being fired for wearing makeup. In Idlib for years before Turkey came in and established full control, colorful hijab was not just frowned upon, it was outlawed, effectively outlawed, along with the public playing of music, pop music, and so on. Things brightened up a little when Turkey came in. But now that's being imposed sort of arbitrarily in areas that HTS controls in Syria. It's not something they can really market to the outside world in the much needed campaign to end sanctions. Sanctions really do need to end. And you've got like Muaz Mustafa, who's Celine Qasim's boss, who was a major player, he was like the liaison in DC for Congress and all politicians who wanted to impose sanctions on Syria and destroy Syria. He was like their Sherpa. And now he's trying to end sanctions because he got the opposition in control. And he's bringing Jewish Syrians to Congress because from sort of an anti-Semitic point of view, Jews are the best way to appeal to the Trump administration and the Republicans. But if you look at the reality on the ground, it's not something that the forces in control in Washington are going to want to reward by rolling back sanctions. It is a disastrous situation.
Yeah, again, I don't think they care about the sectarian violence. It happened for 14 years and no one batted an eye. It's going to happen. And it's just currently, as I said before, Trump is in a bind, because I said this yesterday on a show. He's like a fat woman or a fat man who wants to get on a diet, but the one thing he can't avoid is butter. Like, he wants to pull out of the Middle East, but the one thing he cannot say no to is Bibi's demands. And Bibi is now telling him that you want to keep sanctions on Syria. You want to keep the pressure on Syria so that we can negotiate, so we can have the best deal possible with this newly minted Al-Qaeda government. And they have all the way. So why not? If you put yourself from their perspective, they have all the leverage. So we're not going to see real sanctions relief. So we saw some to symbolize some potential investors that there could be some change down the line in the future. But the real sanctions relief from Washington, I don't think is going to come until Israel gets everything it wants on a long list of demands, whether it pertains to like a southern protectorate for the Druze, David corridor for the Kurds, full and complete unconditional normalization with the Syrian government, the hitherto last sovereign state that had its own independent decision and its own independent army on its border. And if it doesn't get 100% of this list when it's in this amazing, very strong position to negotiate, I don't think the sanctions will be removed in a real way.
Total catastrophe. And Aaron, for those watching, Aaron had to go. My last question is, where is Bashar al-Assad in all this? He's being accused by supporters of HTS of somehow puppeteering this, but he's in Moscow. And, when he arrived there, it took several days for him to even get a meeting with President Putin. That was it was a short meeting. It was like an hour. And it's unclear to me what influence or cards he still holds or what role he plays. Where does he fit into this scenario?
Yeah, from my reading, he holds no cards. He's just on house arrest in Moscow because the Russians have made their calculations. They've made their decisions, and they hold no sympathy or empathy for Assad. One thing that I noted is that his son Hafiz, after introducing this entire fiasco, when he published that video, that pretty stupid video of him walking down the streets and showing everyone where he was living in Moscow.
Yeah.
After that video, that Telegram channel and those social media channels have been quiet. And there's been some fake reports that someone is in contact with him, but I don't think anyone is in contact in a real way with the Bashar dynasty that is now safely kept away, locked away in a nice golden cage in Moscow, is my read.
We heard very little from him during the Gaza genocide. There was not, Syria was keeping quiet. They were hosting or allowing arms to flow to Hezbollah and to the axis of resistance. But Syria was always kind of the weakest link in the axis of resistance. Yeah. And now it's being balkanized. And I haven't seen any reporters interview Assad. I don't think he's been heard from.
Yeah, of course, interviewers, of course, journalists want to interview him, and of course, thousands of writers and reporters and biographers want to go and get a book deal from him. But I don't think the Russians will allow that.
Well, I haven't tried my luck, although I've been called an Assadist for opposing the devious, diabolical process that led to this point for Syria, which was run largely or heavily by my own government. But it just seems like it's not even an issue. This one man is not even an issue anymore. The issue is the underlying power dynamics in the region and the predatory relationship between the imperial countries and their allies and Syria and what's left of Syria. And it also seems like nobody really cares. Like very few, even in alternative media, this isn't really being discussed anymore. It's like, all right, that happened. Assad's gone. Let's call it a day. We're going to keep talking about it.
Max, before we close, can you share the image I sent you on Telegram? It's a family friend of ours. We're trying to bring up attention. He was kidnapped since February 2nd, and we have no clue where he is. And I'm just trying to do what I can to build up some pressure so that maybe some devious person in Damascus is watching this and realizes that there's some reporting on him. Can you just share that picture?
1 second.
Yeah, his name is Musa Dahi. He was a very close family friend of ours. He, carried was a pallbearer with me when I carried the coffin of my grandfather in Syria 2 years ago. He's a very close family friend, and he's been disappeared for the last almost a month and a half. And we were in contact with one potential group that was holding him, an armed militia. We sent them $5,000, and then they just ghosted us. So we don't have any proof of life. We don't have any information. If anyone knows, to get in contact with me on Twitter or on Telegram or something. Yeah, that's all.
I'm sorry to hear that. You're not the first friend of mine with ties to Syria who's been dealing with trying to locate family members. One friend of mine had a family member who the extended family thought that they had been in one of the Syrian government's prisons under Assad. Never found her in any of the prisons when they were emptied, and now have concluded that one of Jolani's gangs actually took her.
Yeah.
That's what so many Syrians are going through. Well, as I said, we're going to continue to cover this. The world needs to know what's happening, because as Hekmat said, if this were happening to any other group in any other country, maybe not any other country or any other group, but what's taking place right now could have triggered a responsibility to protect operation by the West if the victims were worthy of the West.
Months ago.
If they could have been weaponized for geopolitical purposes.
Yeah.
But right now, nobody cares about the Alawites. And again, it would have happened months ago.